I'm sure there's a button somewhere.
No, I think there's a button, but I don't know the button.
Oh. Yeah. Congrats to both teams making it to Nat's Octos and present a case of your choosing.
You're here.
You're here.
Okay. Love running this case. You're a 19-year-old musical spoken word artist singing and starting out. You live in Texas, make good money, but not a substantial amount, to move you into the upper-class territory. But you still have regular engagements and performances, either at a poetry slams of your own spoken word concerts across the Midwest or some niche colleges. You have released a fairly successful album, which chronicles your attempts to swoon as unnamed significant other. You have other hits that deal with issues of racism and social justice. You get home one day at 5 p.m. and there are 2 buttons and a note. On one button reads Malcolm X, on the other, James Baldwin. The note says that if you press a button, then the other button will disappear, and the civil rights figure will appear in your apartment and will discuss only your poetry and rap for exactly 5 hours, upon which time they will disappear. During that time, you will be able to remember everything they tell you. So, just in summary, you can bring either James Baldwin or Malcolm X back for 5 hours to get influence on where to take your rap and your career from here. Caveating that you can only press one button, that both X and Baldwin will care about your development and will work with you for those 5 hours to the best of their ability, that you can take notes but not record any of the conversations, and that nobody will find out about the conversations ever occurring. We say choose Baldwin. Okay. Brief background. James Baldwin was an American novelist, playwright, poet, and social critic.
Could you speak like half as fast?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much.
James Baldwin was an American novelist, playwright, poet, and social critic. Many of his plays fictionalize personal questions of dilemmas and complex social and psychological pressures concerning integration of Black people. He was also gay, which he wrote about extensively along with his relationships with other women. He left the U.S. for Paris when he was 24 and became part of the cultural radicalism concerned with the left bank. One of his most famous works, Go Tell It on the Mountain, chronicles a semi-autobiographical story of John Grimes, an intellectual teenager in Harlem, and his relationship to the Black church. Baldwin would be defined as somewhere in between Kwame Ture / Stokely Carmichael and MLK in terms of radicalism. He was an integrationist, took part in King's marches, but was largely isolated by the formal movement. Baldwin was never truly accepted into the civil rights movement because of the fact that he was an out gay man and because his views were seen as out of sync. Malcolm X was a prolific activist, writer, speaker. X viewed the social movement as a movement for civil rights and a struggle for change. He was far more resistant to social integration and change, and had more radical views about the place of whites within the movement, which he moderated over time. He, of course, had the phrases, up until the week before his death, by any means necessary, the ballot or the bullet. He focused on raising the self-esteem of blacks teleologically by linking them to some sense of black identity. Or I should say African-American identity, like black diaspora type of shit. Any questions?
Yeah. Can we get a little more information on you? Are you for stuff? Yeah. So what kind of stuff do you produce? You said you released some songs, do some poetry slams across the Midwest.
Fairly successful. So this is supposed to be a model off of Khalid, in a world in which he was far more poetic and rappy. So you're like released. You're like 19. You're like kind of starting out. You did like your album is kind of sort of successful. It's mostly
Khalid's actual level of success.
No, you're not. You're like nowhere near.
Okay.
Nowhere near. So like wrote this like a year and a half ago. Okay. So you're like kind of sort of successful. Most of your engagements are like random colleges. You make some money. You have some platform and base. You got like Spotify streams and that sort of thing. Why is it going down? Okay, yeah.
Okay.
What kind of stuff do you write about?
Emotionally complex things about like love.
Cool.
And some issues of social justice.
Great. Love.
Great.
Love.
Okay.
Social justice.
Could you talk a little bit more about like the biggest areas that we should be aware of where like James Baldwin and Malcolm X would diverge in ideology?
Sure. So Malcolm X was like the ballot or the bullet. James Baldwin was like, hey, social integration is probably cool. Malcolm X was highly. Yeah.
I guess, like, how would these diverge beyond like phrases? Is what I'm saying.
So he carried around guns and was very aggressive towards white people.
Okay.
James Baldwin hung out with white people a lot. He lived in Paris.
How long did he live in Paris?
He jumped around Europe a lot. I think like a few years. But he traveled around Europe like most of his life. Okay. He was very cosmopolitan in that sort of way.
Okay. When were both of them alive and active?
Yeah. So Baldwin was active they were both active the same periods, but okay. X obviously was assassinated in 69 or 71, around that time. Mm-hmm. Baldwin lived until he was like 70 something and died in the 90s. Yeah. And so they were both active during the civil rights movement. X had the Nation of Islam. We'll just assume it's the world in which he's still with the Nation of Islam and is not actually double-crossed. So, like, that world.
Okay. Could you talk about so would you say it would be fair to say that during the majority of James Baldwin's activism, he was in Europe?
No. He lived in Europe early, but the vast majority of the time he was talking about U.S. racial politics.
Okay. Could you repeat the things that you said about James Baldwin?
Sure. James Baldwin was an American novelist, playwright, and social critic. Many of his plays fictionalized personal questions and dilemmas amid complex social and psychological pressures concerning integration of black people. He was also gay, which he wrote about extensively, along with his relationships with women. He left the U.S. for Paris when he was 24 and became a part of the cultural radicalism concerned with the left wing.
Okay, could you explain what this was?
I don't particularly know what it is. I just know it's like cultural avant-garde. I imagine like French people and buildings with hollow exteriors, and just like talking about art, talking about literature, talking about the intersections of art and literature and race.
It's not super important.
Yeah.
It's just that's just an example of it,
yeah.
In case of more context, but broadly concerned
making it
about art.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Was this broadly like a art criticism group of?
Not really art criticism, but just more like social theory.
Like a salon?
No.
Okay.
No. I'm gonna stay away from that. Yeah. It's more of like it's very like we're gonna talk about stuff, but it's important to know that's like him when he is 24 to like 28, and like 28 to 72 is him like dancing around the U.S. and like talking about stuff, debating like whatever his name is in 1968. And back in Cambridge at the Cambridge Debating Society or whatever the fuck they call it, and then back in the U.S. talking with MLK and like all this other stuff, just so you get a large representation. And how does it become about the salon?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. You can continue with the other things. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Sorry,
where did I start? One of his most famous works, Go Tell It on the Mountain, chronicles a semi-autobiographical story of John Grimes, an intelligent teenager in Harlem, and his relationship with the black church. Baldwin would be defined as somewhere in between Kwame Ture and slash Stokely Carmichael, because they're one person, and MLK in terms of radicalism. He was an integrationist, took part in, he was a very, very, very semi-communist person, in like the black Marxist tradition, sort of, with like the like some in between like black Marxism and like Malcolm X's whatever stuff. So he was like egregiously pro-black exclusively. Baldwin was not that at all. He was more, but he had some sort of radicality where MLK would be seen as like, we're kind of sanitizing him, but MLK would be seen as like the pragmatist, the Obama-esque figure, and James Baldwin was not that. So yeah.
Okay. Wait. I'm confused. So you're saying Malcolm X was?
Malcolm X is just like super pro-black,
right.
Super like radicalism is necessary, super like fuck white people, all that shit.
Yeah.
James Baldwin was like very close to MLK, but still had resistance, still criticized the same social movements he was a part of, and was largely isolated from the social movements in 1968 because of the fact that he was gay and he was out and open about it, and he like interacted with white people.
Were there any other I guess, how did he diverge specifically from MLK?
It's slightly reductive, but it's like he was literally gay, and MLK was Methodist preacher. So there was that like divergence, and a bunch of other like Baldwin not thought he was more woke, but like you can think of it that way, and that like MLK is talking about stuff, but like we need to talk about like real stuff. Sort of way. So it was like personal stuff, but I would say 95% of it was the social movement left him rather than he left the social movement.
Okay, so like in terms of their own ideology of like what would be like a better future, they didn't really diverge ideologically. It was just more that they had different levels of acceptance.
Baldwin versus the civil rights movement. They had the same stuff. Malcolm X had completely different like visions of where to take radicalism and social change. Yeah.
Can I interject? How much more time do we have on POCs?
You have 4 minutes.
4 minutes left. Thank you. I have some questions about you.
Yes.
You're relatively liberal. Yeah? No? I'm just wondering where your political stance is.
Not in the white liberal type way, but like in the like you're a black liberal who's lived with black people, he probably also like lives with white people also because they're like a spoken word artist who hangs out at colleges. We'll make arguments about that. Yeah.
Are you straight?
Yes.
Okay. I feel like it's important.
Every time no one asks, I'm just gonna make it the MG spike. So. Yeah.
Could you also talk to me fast about like the extent to which like how Malcolm X tended to communicate his views? Like what was the medium that he usually did this through?
Sure. He like had lots and lots of books. Not literary significant books, but like I'm gonna write stuff down. He had lots and lots of speeches. He had phrases within those speeches. Did lots of debates. They both did lots of debates.
Okay. And he was assassinated. How old was he?
Like 40-ish for the 40-ish, we can say. Okay. I can't remember exactly.
40, I think 43.
You can just look it up.
Oh, okay. While you're looking it up, could I also ask? So, are we assuming for the purpose of this case that Malcolm X has
39?
Been, just 39.
Yeah. So he died in 65 and 39.
So we're assuming that we're talking to Malcolm X like at the before he died, like his consciousness before he died.
Yes.
Okay.
And so, James Baldwin was as well. He's not 70.
So it's like a time.
So like just imagine
device.
like Malcolm X has all of his thoughts except for the thoughts that were like I'm going to leave the Nation of Islam, and James Baldwin just has all of his thoughts because like he didn't change thoughts a lot after post 24. He like evolved in that sort of way, but he didn't change his like core beliefs.
Real fast, could you describe like the tenets of the Nation of Islam?
Like I think the ones that would be important for the round are the ones that are like that are more geared towards uniting the diaspora, developing a like inherently a religion that is separate from like the influences of white society.
Creating your own structure.
Yeah.
It lends itself a lot toward movements of radicalism, obviously because a lot of black radicalism is part of it.
Yeah.
That's part of the reason why was like such a big group.
Yeah.
But yeah, broadly just building black structures, using them.
Okay, cool. Do you feel good?
Yep.
We're good?
Yep.
1 minute.
Okay.
It's a lot of stuff.
And I started late, so.
A bit hoarse, but I'll get through it. Is everyone ready?
Yep. Yes.
Our first contention is why you get a more diverse set of viewers and consumers. We think this is important because if we prove we get more individuals both interacting with your spoken word, watching your YouTube, and going to your performance, then you're more likely to be profitable and have material success. Why do we think Baldwin offers this? First subpoint, Baldwin is a far more intersectional person. We think the fact that many of his writings spoke specifically to the plights of minorities, working class, and gays, and who were denied rights, means that it is more likely he will give you the lyrics and phrases necessary to be commercially profitable. We think this is especially true, important going forward. But this is not just racial intersections, but intersections in class and emotion, gender and sexuality, all of which you personally can relate to as someone who writes emotionally complex music and was largely probably stigmatized and in school and growing up because he wrote that emotional music. Along those lines, Malcolm X went abroad. James Baldwin engaged in the markets that, to a much greater extent, will be key going forward in the future, such as most important in Europe and specifically Britain. We think that because he knew how to unite the diaspora, so to speak, around many of the themes of oppression, you are more likely to create music that bridges the gap between racism and oppression in the U.S. and oppression abroad. We think this magnifies your appeal, gives you access to more viewers, and gives you a crucial edge amongst rappers in the U.S. We also think the nature of Malcolm X's politics makes it impossible to get out of the rigidity of black nationalism. That's to say, X was very explicit in his views and demands and much harder to incorporate for white audiences. We think that it is factually true that whites may consume lots of rap, but they don't want to be associated with the overthrow of the U.S. government, and their parents will never actually let them go to concerts in which that is prescribed. Now, they may say that Malcolm X points more to the current movement, but we think that that point is both not true and unimportant. It may be true that X confronted racism in a brazen manner, but Baldwin did the same thing through actual literature. It was radical for Baldwin to be out in the 50s and 60s. It was radical to embrace hope while still demanding rights from the state. Secondarily, we think that Baldwin's appeal to both hope and resistance is more in line with what the public wants to read and what the writ large black communities want to read. So we still get that black audience that probably outweighs the marginal cases on their side of the house. Second subpoint, we think is Baldwin is more representative of what the future of rap will look like. That is to say, you will be viewed as a trailblazer in that regard. The future of rap looks like highly complex personal forces within many individuals. You can look at this through trends in experimental R&B, rappers who push their boundaries, especially since every new boundary-pushing style is itself new and not duplicatable. This is essential towards raising your standing and won't be seen as flip-flopping. The missing link between those rappers and the entire new market is that you have original source material necessary to translate all of that raw emotions into poetry that will draw people in. Baldwin would have been seen as extremely avant-garde for his time as a gay black man in the 50s until his death, who was upfront about his sexuality. Additionally, Baldwin has untopped original source material and content. We think that in the status quo, most artists utilize Malcolm X's style of rhetoric because he is well known and associated as being more radical. You can look at this article. This can look to this in lyrics like "Fuck the Police" or the emergence of Kendrick Lamar's "And We Hate Po-Po," "Wanna Kill Us Dead" in the street for show. The problem is that you can never distinguish yourself over the long term by following this style. Best case scenario, you get some fans, but you are already profitable within your specific genre, so it's unclear as to why that is unique for their side of the house. What is the impact? And why is this important for them? Because record labels are also looking more and more toward the international appeal of rappers. The reason why rappers like Drake are incorporating beats and lyrics and styles is not because it creates objectively better music, he doesn't win any Grammys, but because he has a broader appeal. What are the impacts? First, you are more likely to get a record deal that actually acknowledges your artistic merit, as well as pays you a lot and offers you the more to branch out long-term into emerging markets. Especially in the 21st century, when many record labels are no longer run by a few white men, but either more independent run by rappers like Jay-Z and Rock Nation, are looking for fresh talent that get on our side of the house. On their side of the house, you will burn out or not create any long-term success if you are always following the status quo narratives. And comparative is clear here. You will compete with many other rappers who have a lot more money and were doing it to begin with, who you will never actually beat out. Second, we think that you have more intersectional lyrics, you develop a more complex, extremely devoted fans within the niche groups and consume music later down the line. This is because each fan or group of fans can look to lyrics, songs, and styles as something that they want in music, and are more likely to spread it to their own friends and consumers. This is comparative is simple. On their side of the house, you may get one group of fans, but those fans will not far more outlets to consume similar content with their friends, and they will, on their side of the house, you are pinned as unoriginal because you are basically copying patterns. Flip-flopping is a cardinal sin in music, as anyone knows, so you will get the worst arm of arguments on their side of the house. Final impact, long-term, we think you create more social change by having you representing yourself as a figure that the people can look to within the rap constituency. Young activists will play your music and it will inspire them and to better themselves. On their side of the house, you are more likely to create music that is either offensive and not intersectional and actively offensive towards women. Even if they don't get more music on their side of the house, then the music will be not fulfilling your obligation to be as open as possible to yourself. Second contention is why you can produce personally better content on our side of the house. We think that the foundational to your existence as a spoken word artist is not only producing lots of content, but also producing content which people are able to communicate through narratives they present. On those few hours, Baldwin is far more likely to advance your literature. The comparative is clear. Baldwin has released far more books and literarily significant figure. We think that it is likely that there are both untapped and unwritten reserves of knowledge that Baldwin can draw on to create and incorporate into your existing lyrics to make them better. Additionally, Baldwin lived in a far longer time and saw the evolution of rap teleologically in a way that X could not. Because of the era that X lived in, there did not seem to be the emergence and the quick effects of the civil rights movement, and it's hard to see how we'd be able to relate directly and quickly to the narratives of the present, i.e. they have out of date, and we'll spend hours trying to catch them up on all of those issues. Now, they may say that Baldwin has the books and you can just look at them. This is false. Firstly, it's the difference between reading Go Tell It on the Mountain and knowing how to write a book like Go Tell It on the Mountain. Baldwin had crafted the process of writing from literal decades, and you have been seen in close acquaintance with dozens of poets, professors, and intellectuals in the avant-garde movement. And in those few hours, you can deconstruct dozens of song lyrics, as well as giving you the tools to build your craft going forward and developing a framework of understanding other music. And the very fact is you will absorb every word he says means that you can go into so much depth of the possible issues, something that he is known for doing, and you will remember. What are the impacts? We think that you don't have a sound base or creating original content. You're more likely to not find joy in creating music or starting to create bad, repetitive music. We think that because fresh music is valued in the industry, if you cannot garner new inspiration, they're less likely to buy your records and give up on large deals that are associated with you. Second impact, we think on their side of the house, there's little chance anything Malcolm X gives you will actually be able to be used to music. That is to say, it may be great to have lots of rhetoric by Malcolm X because he's a rhetorician, but you can just look to YouTube videos for that. On our side of the house, you have all the content tomorrow. On our side of the house, we have a genuine literary figure that knows language, phrases, and ways to communicating with artists. This is damning for their side of the house because they cannot prove actual music will come of it. You can just pick us up automatically. Proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister and all leader of the opposition.
Here.
Cool. First of all, thanks so much for running this case, guys. It's an honor to hit you guys in Knott's Octos. Thanks to everybody for watching, for judging, obviously. And Rika, it's been an unbelievable pleasure to be able to debate with you this past year. Thank you so much. Is everybody ready?
Yeah.
Okay. 2 overviews, then 2 points on the off case. First thing I want to say is that 5 hours of time with this person is not enough to uproot all of the things that you understand about the world around you. It isn't the case that you're going to become some sort of violent nationalist. It isn't the case that you're probably going to become someone who's super bigoted and not accepting of other people just because these were occasionally some of the things that, say, the Nation of Islam espoused. What we're telling you is that this will probably push you in a direction that you can act in such a way that is most inspiring towards the type of teleological black identity that Malcolm X was able to espouse. The important things that you can do in the 5 hours are to try to fit in how this universal endpoint for black identity in the United States can apply to the modern day, how it actually fits into modernity. That's what we think the value is. The second overview I want to talk about is why I think their universalist message is kind of bullshit. Because we do not think it's possible for you to just be able to speak for everyone in like emerging markets, to be able to speak for the experience that black women face inside of the United States. So it isn't the case that your top priority should be to branch out and try to speak for everyone in a Walt Whitman style of the universalist man, right? We think it is significantly better to try to isolate the experiences that you can actually speak to in order to be able to send a message that is compelling, one that is useful, and one that is authentic. First point on the off case, we want to talk about the importance of a message of activism. Why do we think this is so much more important than advancing your own career? First of all, we think it is the case that the least will offer in situations where small increases in the amount of activism present can do things like stop the advance of like violence in their communities, can do things like pass high amounts of activism can do things like pass local policies that reform school boards, teach better education. They can do things like we've seen like amounts of activism be able to like shut down the repeal of the Medicaid expansion. These are the types of things that actually affect individuals' lives, and so we think an end goal of your movement should be to push more of this activism in an authentic way. We think this is more important than your own personal advancement because A, they say you already have enough money that you're relatively comfortable. So, I mean, Jay can talk about how much better it is to be a millionaire than someone who has $100,000 in the bank, but we don't think the marginal returns on cash are actually that good. That'd actually be bad. So let's give a characterization of what your current message is, because we tell you it is one of love, it is one of social justice, this is what they explain, but it is not necessarily inspiring of action. How do we know this? It's because it hasn't been spreading around the country, right? It isn't something that is like totally universalist in these types of, or it isn't something that has been able to actually catch on, because what we think is that it lacks the type of motivating teleological endpoint that is a common identity. It isn't the case that like black listeners to your music or to your spoken word poetry identify with the kind of messages that you put forward 100% of the time, which is why oftentimes they're just putting down your record, they're leaving your show, and they're not coming back. So why do we think that it is significantly better on our side of the house? We think this type of endpoint that is actually identifying and uniting of the individuals, of other individuals in the like black community of the United States is exactly what you will learn from Malcolm X, but not necessarily one that you will learn from James Baldwin. Two arguments as to why we think it's so important that you're able to push forward this message of activism, right? Like acting within a system that can actually create change. First, we think you have a principled obligation to inspire people through your art. We think this is simply the case for all the reasons I explained to you, and that it actually does lead to significantly better ability for them to self-actualize. Why do we get a better message on our side of the house? First, we think we actually get a message that individuals within the black community can associate with because of their individual identities. We think that a message of like intersectionality is valuable in that it forms acceptance, right? And we think that you can still advocate for like accepting individuals regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their national orientation, things like that. But it isn't a motivating factor for selling records, for hitting the streets, for going to protest. Second thing is we think you're going to have a significantly less watered down message from Malcolm X because he died early, right? He wasn't alive during periods of significant amounts of like racial consolidation with a white mainstream message. We think he maintained hard to his guns, and he will maintain a message of acting out and doing your best to actually get social change. And third is that we think James Baldwin found acceptance in his own community, and the fact that he was able to move to Paris and find people who accepted him for who he was means that necessarily his message of pushing back, of helping people who haven't found this kind of place is going to be watered down because he was able to die with this kind of happiness and this kind of expectance. The second thing I want to talk about here is we just think this will lead to more pragmatic outcomes insofar as people will be protesting on the streets more. We think this is distinctly better. Yeah, we'll see. Maybe they'll argue with that, but Rico will have some stuff to say if they do. Second thing is we think even if this is the case, even if you don't buy the weighing as to why it's better to inspire people, you'll have a better career trajectory. Two reasons. First is because we think there's a growing audience for the type of music that you're creating, the type of poetry that you're creating. We think it's like they just assert that Kendrick Lamar has saturated the market, right? There's no more room for this type of message. But we really don't think this is the case. And we think rather the way people form associations with the type of art they like is not just they listen to like one artist or something like this. When they find a particularly inspiring artist, like say Kendrick Lamar, it inspires them to try to learn about other types of music that are similar and to relish things that are like similar but maybe have some divergences, which is exactly where we think you'll be able to fit in if you're espousing a similar message but are doing so in slightly different ways by advocating or by using like spoken word poetry or something like this. We think you have the opportunity to access the huge demands from the black community that it associates well with this message of fighting back against oppression, but also be able to reap in on cash if that's what they care about a white community who is growingly concerned with social justice issues, without having to entrench yourself in the very white community, but just being able to enjoy the fruits of their consumerism, right? We think this is the better outcome. On their side of the house, which is the second subpoint here, I want to be comparative, is that we think the white mainstream is likely to dilute your message significantly. Two reasons why. We think the messages they tell you about how, okay, first of all, we just think it's the case that, we think it's the case that the warranting that they do for you about why they think your messages of like going out and protesting are probably going to be scary will be understood by like prominent like white cultural like record companies and stuff like this. So the only way to be able to like sign on to like do a tour with Drake or something like this, or sign on to the same like record label that like also signed like Elton John like 20 years ago, is going to be able to water down your message and get something that is acceptable to the mainstream community. We think this is not going to reward you in the end because you'll still be an outsider. You probably still won't headline, but you'll also have made the giant concession of having to water down your message so that the white parents that they think are so important will allow their kids to attend your shows. On case. First thing they say is you're going to get a more diverse set of viewers. They say you attract more intersectionality. Give them their best case scenario, and all of a sudden you're writing music or something that is reaches out to say black women inside of the United States. We think you're stealing the place of somebody else who could have easily produced this music in a more compelling way because they actually identified and felt the type of experiences that they want to talk with. So in as far as you're probably displacing, say, a black female artist, in as far as you espouse trying to act as if you felt the same way that they have, because we think consumers are oftentimes easily fooled, you're being less authentic and you're stealing space. We think espouse acceptance, but don't steal this type of space. They say it's more emotionally complex, but we think insofar as James Baldwin found an acceptant community, it's probably not so emotionally complex. And we think it will be complex if you breed the stuff that you're currently feeling with the type of message that Malcolm X is sending. Next, you'll say you'll turn into a black nationalist. No, you won't. It's not enough time. They say parents won't allow you to go to your concerts. We think A, parents most of the time probably don't screen the music. They care about that much. And B, even if your concerts are slightly smaller, they don't care. They say you'll talk about that there's not enough room for more fuck the police people. We think this is a growing market. They say you want to access emerging markets. We think it's silly to think you can legitimately represent them, and we don't think it's worth your time because you'll probably never create music that they'll really love that much. Next thing they say is this will lead to more social change because you'll be offensive towards women. We think you can easily dilute this out. It's the 21st century. You feel a lot of pressure from contemporaries who espouse better acceptance, and we think you'll be better connected with more socially liberal communities. Last thing they say is better content because of Baldwin's books. But 5 hours is not enough to tell you all the stories you need to be able to fill your songs with cool, neat stories. We think the better thing is to seek inspiration and to see a message of how the teleological black identity can push your music forward.
I thank the leader of the opposition and call upon a member of the government.
Here.
Are you clapping or what was that?
Wake up.
Oh, okay. Just a long overview, off case, on case. You may need more paper or a new Excel column.
Yep, adding a column.
I'm gonna wing it.
Yeah, everybody? Yep. So two very big and crucial from the entirety of the LSC that don't pretty much answer the entire question of what actual X music actually leads to. So the first thing I want to talk about here is they have two parts of radicalism that fundamentally are just not compatible with status quo. Because he comes up here and says, oh yeah, we're tending to fight the policeness, but one fat claim, all this kind of radicalism we say in PMC was old school rap. Those who own labels right now are old school rap. Why is this important? Because those who had that style of rap are one, not popular anymore, just fat claim, NWA isn't popular anymore, and two, they want fresh things. Why is this true? Because they know that innovation gives them more records as far as right now, people like No Name, people like Rhapsody, are those pressing toward more initiative, more poetic, more deep, more intellectual kind of rap, if there are they're differentiating themselves from old styles of old school rap. That's what we understand the house. Fundamentally here, the problem is you must emphasize the future. They don't ever prove any links to this, so therefore they get to become here and say, oh no, it's all like the police rap. And furthermore, even if that is true, why do they not get it? Because one, it's not your life. Meaning there is a plethora of people from the hood, side of the rappers, who can pick up the street and give them this job. Meaning that long term they're going to sign someone with the fuck the police rap, it'll be someone who actually lived that life, not you. Two, the only way you actually get momentum and actually have the fans they want this in the house is if they have your existing base. Why is this bad? Because Drew tells you, and it's cold conceded, that you must have momentum. If you're a flip-flopper, it's something's bad upon you. That flip-flopping in rap is always a bad thing, loses your fans. If you lose your fans, you have no base, meaning there is no way to grow, meaning the only thing they have to all their advocacy of having an actual fan base to actually listen to your concerts never actually happens because all your current fans simply say, oh, you're diverging now, I'm going to leave you, I'm not listening to you anymore. Second problem here is that fundamentally their radicalism is contextual. Let's say, oh, 5 hours isn't enough. Okay, one, you remember everything is in construct, and two, it's much worse than their side. Why? Because the radicalism of Malcolm X is one, hyper-contextual, which means two things. One, you must now take what he tells you and transform it to status quo insofar as like radicalism in the 60s, shooting white people is not a thing you do right now, meaning all their radicalism impacts must be recontextualized and shifted by you. Why can't you do it? Because one, if you could do it, you wouldn't have Malcolm X, insofar as you need him to learn it, you couldn't do it anyway. And it's simple like contradiction in their entire case. But secondarily here, why is all of them better? One, broad themes is more than intersectional. As far as that is true, we get broad themes that are not tied to one time, meaning we learn them once and need no transformation. What we give you here outside the house are the tools of rap, not his books, the tools of language to communicate your existing ideas better, meaning your base is amplified outside the house, whereas on their side, I prefer a total shift to genres you don't even believe in, you don't actually want. Final thing here is, again, this is an actor. You don't want this. If you want to be a politician, you'd already be one. You don't want to kind of radicalism. You want to promote your ideas through music. That is the advocacy you have. If they case shift away from that, they lose around on face. Let's go off, guys. So first thing we tell you here, is that like, oh, it won't change you, how X won't change you. Okay. Massive double blind. If their argument is you can suddenly become a hyper-radical, but also X won't change you at all, how can they get both things? Make them choose one. Next thing you said, like, universalism is bad. Okay, not universalism. I don't really care if like Danny White Boy from like suburbia doesn't listen to music. What we get here is all the black individuals who are currently like black liberals are progressing toward more complex types of rap. They don't contest that's going to the entirety of the round. Given that, you must get them. It's not universalism. It is an ontological connection across all black individuals via intersectionality. The problem we have with Chinese rappers is that they're one, sexist, and two, homophobic. Why is their base entirely that thing inside the house? Because one, they want X-style radicalism to control people. Why is that bad? Because the reason James Baldwin was in like a different community wasn't because oh, he's just not complex, he left. No, because the black community was sexist and homophobic, meaning he left. We say that in case conflict, no contested. Given that, what's the issue? Meaning, if they want to endorse intersectionality, they pick someone who's literally sexist and racist and homophobic, that's their advocacy. They want that, meaning the status quo rap pressing away from that kind of thing keeps that in their house. Meaning they get no sales as far as to be shut down early on. Next thing they tell us here, the first point is like activism is better. I've already answered this before, but 5 kind of talks to this whole activism point. One, whites will flinch. Why is this bad? Because they use two kind of paths here. Path 1 is hyper-radical, make social change. Path 2 is get good music because white people listen to it. Here's the problem. If you're hyper-radical saying, oh, kill the white people, in that case, then they listen to music made worse than listen to the house. The alternative is you're not so radical, meaning you have no net change, meaning their entire flowers is useless, you prefer our side. Secondarily here, second response to this, is that you don't really care about politics. 3, no obligation. I want to answer the obligation thing really clearly because it's kind of fucked up. Okay, black people, surprise, surprise, don't have an infinite obligation to fix racism. Why? Because they didn't cause it. 2, because if it were true, it's infinite. It's fundamentally recursive. If it's true that every actor must do this, there is no end line, there will be a bright line, maybe you shouldn't take it. But furthermore, fundamentally, if you have the ability to create some kind of change and it fits your actual desires, you need to your own obligation to internal systems, you do what you can do and do what you can do better. Meaning, to prove the obligation, you must 1, prove it's universal, and 2, prove that they actually win the case. They only prove the obligation while winning the round, therefore they can't win the round via the obligation. This is a logical fallacy here. Final thing here, you actively just don't want this. It's a simple fact that you don't care about this, you don't want this to be your advocacy. If you want radicalism in rap, you do it already. You don't do this for us, you don't want this. Next thing I tell you here is like, people need to assimilate and whatnot, people need to understand. Okay, Baldwin was pro-integration, Malcolm X was not. Very easy answer that. Your music doesn't help you in that regard. Next thing, you're saying X will have a meaning of, a product of acting out. Okay, you scare away white people. Sure, fighting out all of our harms there. No one actually listens to you. There are no politics as far as if you are a part of a political regime that literally lets people getting shot. Either A, you get shot, or B, it's just never received. You get no politics. So in their best case scenario, they get nothing. In the worst case scenario, they get something small that you don't actually want. It never takes off the ground because you lose your fans. Final thing here, radicalism good. Okay, just no. You always slowly die away. You never actually sign. Here's the crucial link. You must be signed to actually grow. Insofar as they don't actually answer any points of why you aren't being signed, there is no actual link to the entire advocacy, meaning they have no impacts there. So there are losing around on face. Final thing to say in the off case is like, oh yeah, you get the audiences, you want to find someone inspiring. Okay, sure. If you want to be inspirational and find someone, who would you pick for inspiration? Are you inspired by a saturated market full of people you already know? Are you inspired by something rap you see every single day on the radio? Are you inspired by a new form of rap to the future of rap music, insofar as the future of where all the money is, because the record producers you already know, I will head to the future. Why would I buy versus rap to be dead in 2 years and buy one to be profitable for 25 years? You will always just understand how people decide more often. On case. First thing is saying intersectionality, how you're taking place of women. Okay, so this is major about the warrant. The warrant isn't, oh yeah, just like become the forefront of like feminist movements. No, the warrant was don't be a sexist. Like in simple words, you're like don't disparage women, don't disparage non-men, don't use like the F word in your songs, don't like make fun of LGBTQ communities. That's the warrant here. So what we understand in the house is you're not sexist. It's not like taking the place of any woman, so there is no actual harm here. Next thing is like here is you must like not be complex as Baldwin said that. Okay, this warrant just doesn't make any sense. Insofar as he was pushed out of the community, he fundamentally understands the view of the oppressed people and the views of the oppressors, meaning he is the only person who actually has the link. They say you in their own LLC, oh, Malcolm X died before he saw anything happen. Okay, cool. He knows one half of the battle. Congratulations. You have no information now. Next thing I tell you here is that your parents don't stream music. Okay, sure. Fact claim here. If your advocacy is being as upfront and political as possible to radicalism, parents will hear about it. If the parents hear, oh yeah, that new rapper Khalid, yeah, he was showing people, okay, white son, sorry Charlie, you can't listen to this anymore. That's how we listen to that house. Next thing I say here is like, you don't want to have, the hell? You don't get signed or not. Okay, already answered in the off case. Final two things about like, you need to have, 5 hours from enough. Okay. Weighing here, because I'm never actually weighing it in the MG. So, there's the house publicity. They have 5 hours. They must do 5 things. 1, hear what Malcolm X says, recontextualize it. 2, make sure that recontextualization is correct. 3, somehow shift away from your current style of music to Malcolm X. 4, kind of invent the tools to do so into Malcolm X. Because 1, fact claim here, guys, if he inspired short-term change via radicalism, his speeches were inherently less complex. Why is this true? Because a book is literature. If he wants to inspire someone on the fly via speech, which cannot be complex literarily, because it must be a literal critique of what actual blackness means. Meaning their speech is always simpler, meaning we get it outside the house too. We tell you in case, we can literally just read his speeches into ours. That's our advocacy. There's no complexity for X, meaning long term, we get both as better as they do. The problem here is they can't get us. Why? Because the 5 hours spent to learn the tools of Baldwin means if we both can read books outside the house, only we get both books, actually understand both books, and know the tools to use the music to create the content of both books. On their side, then, is of course, there is no tool linkage here. We can delink all their offense, fundamentally turn it to our side. Because we read, as far as we need no link to Malcolm X, because fundamentally here, if we get Baldwin, probably get X out of the way, because as far as Baldwin knew a critique X, so other way we get all this offense here. Final thing to tell you here is that ultimately they will always outweigh the politics. Okay, so they must choose in this round. Either they choose to have politics you don't want, or they choose to have the advocacy you do want. In the politics world, you lose your own kind of music, meaning there is no truth to your music. We give you the warrant about this important, wait most of the round, we are proud to propose.
I take the member of government and call upon the member of the opposition.
Everyone cool?
Yeah. Yep.
I think the real comparative of this debate is what information can you actually get from a 5-hour conversation that you couldn't otherwise get from the vast majority of literature that is dedicated towards interpreting both of these individuals' works. So in my speech, I'm going to give reasons why I think that Malcolm X's identity is so maligned, such that I think that there's both one, far less information and ability for you to actually interpret what he means when he says things. 2, it's far more likely that we tend to oversimplify what his views actually were. And 3,
the notion that we could presume that he wouldn't be capable of speaking to what the current day looks like seems kind of absurd to me. So, a couple reasons why I think Malcolm X's identity is likely to be far more maligned, and the 5 hours of you talking to him will give you far more unique information from what you could otherwise get from just choosing to both, one, consume the media that Baldwin actually created, and additionally, all of the scholarship that surrounded it, because he was both accepted in Europe and within America and had a wide reach and was widely very popular. First reason, because schools and colleges tend to be very hesitant to hire professors who are rampantly political or willing to throw themselves behind, for example, very, very controversial figures, because they also receive funding and donations from oftentimes very conservative people, and they usually don't try to toe the line between high levels of extremism. This means that lots of professors just choose not to actually specialize within a specific brand of ideology, which means they're far less likely to actually produce work pertaining to it. They're also would be worse for their careers, things like that. Two, there was a long history of firing individuals during the Red Scare, both any kind of economist that actually advocated for socialism and communism during this period, and there was a huge exodus of professors from a lot of universities also who felt that their ideology was being suppressed. So it's just also unclear that you actually have a lot of professors that are even teaching the sort of brand of economics and identity politics that specifically Malcolm X actually had. Also from a self-interested perspective. And third, the fact that he died earlier means that he wasn't able to write at times in which there was widespread ability to actually access his works, by which that wouldn't have needed to go through standard monopolistic forms of publications, which is really significant because the fact that Baldwin was able to write in the 90s means that a lot more of his work that actually was able to reach the public sphere was information that he could have used for more independent presses, something that we didn't see actually arriving until far later into the 70s, after we saw the decentralization of a lot of news media coverage. This is really significant because this means that no one in this room actually can epistemologically say that they fully understand who Malcolm X was or what he actually published. Additionally, I think the fact that he died earlier just means that the intensity with which he holds his views is also far less likely to have been watered down than talking to a 90-year-old James Baldwin, however he died in the 90s, who has largely seen the way that the world has progressed and then such watered down his views over time. So you are also engaging with a worldview and ideology that is far more extreme. So why do I think this is so significant? Firstly, to respond to the identity politics points, realize that if you're just shopping around between college campuses doing spoken word poetry and writing music, it's just definitely the case that the modern day has far more sophisticated identity politics than whatever existed during James Baldwin's time. So even if it was the case that he tended to be rather radical at the time period and happened to be gay, we don't think that he actually would speak most saliently to the way in which progressivism has actually progressed. So I think he'll probably be comparatively more regressive than even the ideology that you currently hold. So I don't think that this is a unique thing that he would individually bring to you. Additionally, we would say that at the point that you can't speak on all of these identities, but we think by far more you can speak on the identity of just feeling afraid as a consequence of your race. They say that you grew up in Houston, you've definitely most likely experienced some form of being concerned with the police. And thirdly, we would also say that hate crimes affect everyone in society, whereas forms of intersectionalism only affect a specific subclass of people. And I think that you can far more speak on these issues than you can the question of intersectionality. Also, at the point that Baldwin tended to be more accepted, you can generally assume that his identity politics fall more in line with just the vast majority of other philosophers who have managed to succeed and can speak on racial politics in this way. So just the very fact that there are tons of other philosophers who speak on these sorts of issues, and there's a marketplace of ideas wherein people choose to buy, give money, and give attention and give retweets to, the manners of ideologies that you're likely to encounter are likely to be far more derivative of Baldwin, which means even if you're talking to the source, it's really significant that a lot of the things that he might tell you will be relatively redundant. And also, it's really bad if you become certain that just because you had a fever dream and believe that you managed to communicate with James Baldwin, that this means that you might feel especially able to speak on these sorts of issues, and the issues that women face, which will give you a false impression that you can legitimately occupy this space. That's bad. Okay, he says that okay. Thirdly, why do I think this really, you really shouldn't be weighing at all the effect that this has on your musical ability? Firstly, responding to, the ending of his statement, he says that it'll be really difficult to recontextualize Malcolm X. So this just seems ridiculous. Strong ideologies, like if you were to talk to Kant, it wouldn't matter if Kant was alive now as opposed to, 50 years ago, because a strong, coherent ideology is immaterial of the circumstances in which it's instantiated. It prescribes forms of actions that are generated from, certain sets of values that we think are so ideologically divergent from what likely exists that you wouldn't even know to consider them as independent values because you've been desensitized from actually understanding, what about your identity specifically makes you different, or what about your experience you should actually treasure. Thus, at the point that you don't even know that these things are values that you ought to be pursuing, just someone telling you this or someone giving you this sense gives you the ability to pretty easily contextualize it in the status quo. So I think this is kind of ridiculous. And secondarily, we would say that, on this question of recontextualization, somebody explaining to you the symbolism in, a literary work is similarly, complex and would take up time to the recontextualization of you needing to say, okay, you've given me, your ideology, how do I instantiate it into the present day? Similarly, you need to spend that time then decoding what his, literary work was into an ideology and then instantiating that ideology from 20 years down the line. So, honestly, I think this is a super marginal point. Fourthly, the likelihood of you signing onto an album or having more chance of success is both, one, not something that you should put any weight on in this round, insofar as this is hugely based on forms of luck, and I don't think that you talking to either of these individuals will necessarily hugely affect your career trajectory, and two, is really based on your skill and whether or not you're decent at being able to communicate any idea of any sort, which is something that is static on both sides of the house, so I don't think that this particularly changes anything. And thirdly, at the point that you're already relatively successful and doing sufficiently well enough such that you can at least get your message out there, we think that, one, the fact that there's far more means of being able to get your music out without needing to go through basic record companies, as we see a rise of, you can just become popular on YouTube and Spotify, like Kishibashi, who's an experimental violinist, we think that you really don't need to, base all of your efforts merely on the idea of whether or not you're actually able to go into production. So, responses. All on this question of you'll become too radical such that people will actually abandon you. One, just listening to a radical ideology does not make you individually more radical. You're not suddenly going to pivot your message or flip-flop. It just means that you expand the Overton window of what you think constitutes extremism, such that the middle and how you reconcile between two extreme ideologies actually gets more sophisticated. We think that instead of actually just adopting the ideology of whoever you're talking to, what's really significant is that being presented with a different philosophical framework of being able to consume the world and things around you actually gives you better of an ability to contrast different ideas and come to different decisions and critical reasoning between different concepts, which we think is a more valuable skill in the long run. On the question of white people listening to their music, I totally don't care about this point. Damn was super popular. We don't think that on either side, even if you pivot more to slightly more extreme in the long run, that you should particularly care about this by their own reasoning, that you shouldn't particularly care about whether or not white people care about you. I don't care. Okay, then on the question of I think that most of this is implicitly responded to. On the question of whether or not you should care about the avant-garde, realize that tons of artists are just shit at explaining how to actually create art, even though they themselves are pretty good at it. There's no reason or caveat in the case as to why he would be capable of actually assisting you in the creational process, as opposed to just saying, oh, this is what I kind of did. Very proud to oppose.
I think a member of the opposition is a solid leader of the opposition.
First area of the debate is what is best for the least well off. What's the weighing that they drop from LSE? We told you, and they had a chance to respond, but didn't, that we don't think more money is going to make you significantly happier. They don't give us a reason why this is some sort of end goal that you should really care about, so we think you should care about this most. Not because you have an infinite obligation to all black people, but because of the warranting that we've been giving you about how individuals who say are being stripped from having housing policy or having public housing or reasonable public health care are those who can gain the most from small amounts of change, and we think this is a pretty simple utilitarian calculus. Cool. What do you actually learn from this conversation? What we explain to you is that there is a huge amount of untapped information inside of the status quo that you will finally be able to attain because you're able to actually talk to the creator of this type of message. Scholarship is not available. You cannot read critical analysis of this. We tell you you will not even be able to find a ton of his works because it was either diluted being published in the mainstream or was published in really small stuff that was probably lost. And third is that we tell you it is simply a far more extreme ideology, which is actually how you you can contextualize your actions or can contextualize actions in the modern day with like a reasonable endpoint. What do they say? They say Malcolm X will be regressive. He's going to do shitty stuff. They never explain to us, as we beat in the overview of LOC, and Rika continues to reiterate, that this isn't enough time to make you also into someone who's really regressive on these bigoted policies. But even if it is enough time to convince you, we told you that they'll both be regressive, right? And we think that the weighing here is clear, right? On their side of the house, we think you will feel as if you can speak for other individuals.
Point of order. So the idea that they're both regressive, the MO response was not that they're both regressive, but that James Baldwin will take some amount of time to be caught up on social movements. I think that's a distinction.
You don't be taken under consideration.
Oh, no, I'm pretty sure Rika said the words that he would be regressive.
You don't take under consideration.
Cool. On their side of the house, we think you will feel like you can speak for others, you can feel like you will speak for women and stuff like this. Jay's only response to this is like, oh, don't do that, we're just saying don't be a sexist. But this doesn't address the underlying warrants that regardless of whether or not it's a good or a bad thing, we think it's obviously bad, you will do it, right? And we think the higher probability of that on their side of the house means you're more likely to exclude people on this regard. What do you get from the knowledge? That's the other question under this point. You get an end goal, you get a purpose of unity, and you get something that is inspiring. Because they never question the fact that you already have the ability to do things like produce music and spoken word poetry, but that it isn't something that is inspiring to large groups of people. So you need to be able to address these types of things, contextualize them in the modern day, which we think your discussion with Malcolm X will actually be able to do, which will be able to push people to act in modernity, push people to protest local politicians, to protest school boards, these types of things that actually help other individuals on the ground, and that will push societal perceptions of this time of artwork in a type of way that can actually do things like shift the Overton window and make more liberal policies or policies that are better for the least well off seem more accessible from society, right? Recognize that.
So when I have in the flow, the point with the Overton window is that you understand the ideologies better. The point was not that because you expand it, therefore policies become better. I think it's a distinction.
You know, also be taken under consideration.
Okay, yeah.
Not independently.
Second thing is on what's better for your music, right? First of all, recognize, so this is if you're voting on like what's materially best for you, even though you don't care for whatever reason about what's materially best for the least well off. Recognize, and here's the weighing at the top, that we really think that record deals are probably mostly based on like luck and skill, right? So we don't think it's the case that these, or we think it's the case that trying to expand to the most popular markets is the only way to be able to access these things in the long run. What do they say? They say you get new tools, right? You get the ability to do this type of stuff. But they don't respond, we have two big responses to this. The first that they don't respond from LOC is that this is what you already have, right? They drop the argumentation about how you already are writing stimulating music. You already are writing like spoken word poetry, the type of lyrical stuff that they say people are so interested in. But the other thing that they miss, and that Rika extends significantly, is that the type of tools that you'll be getting from Baldwin, even in the best case scenario, are likely to be redundant. It's likely to be trite stories that people already relatively understand. It's likely to not associate with modernity because it is not the type, it is not created from the type of experiences, right? So the weighing here is like, look, we get a type of ideological motivation for your speeches so that we think can cross time, and we think a 5-hour conversation with Malcolm X can easily allow you to apply it to modern day conversations about what types of policies and things like that are actually bad for society. They get stories, they get lyricism, but these are the types of things that are rooted in the time period that they occurred in and that aren't going to be associatable by modern audiences. We also think he's probably just going to be shit at explaining most of the literary process, so you're not going to gain much. Look, the final thing under this is even if you're voting on like record deals, we told you and they miss that there's a huge new market for this type of revolutionary music, things like Damn, and record deals are swimming because this material makes money from, as we said, both black populations and the increasingly liberal majority population of the U.S.
First question, do you have obligations? Firstly, Jay gave you 5 responses that were not responded. First, blacks don't have obligations to slave because they're not the masters, the whites are. So they don't have obligations, the worst off in society as they're talking. 2, they have to prove infinite obligations. Insofar as infinite obligations are infinitely regressive, as soon as you solve the obligation, you still have the obligation until it's in place. So it's a contradiction. All these words were in Jay's speech. Delinks all the stuff that was said about social issues. Second, underneath this, then give them their best case scenario. Wait, we tell you Malcolm X was not a literary figure, therefore he can't communicate discourse. They're like, but like, you can't actually understand anything. There's so much epistemic uncertainty about what he knew in the past or the present. Then what the fuck does he know? Like, they cannot give you a single line of actual social theory that he knows right then that can be applied to right now. At least compare the somewhat weighing that maybe James Baldwin is someone who was poor, black, and knew the entire rest of the country and did not advocate literal, like violence towards women, violence towards gays, is probably more in tune with the actual marketplaces in question. This outweighs massively because they can see all this stuff we tell you about international markets. But second, in terms of social movements...
Really fast. So I heard like a blip in PMC that was that Malcolm X was not good for women. I think the characterization that he advocated for violence against gay individuals was like a new statement.
Only women, then.
You'll be taken
Okay.
Maybe that too. Yeah, just
Okay. But secondly, in terms of like the levers of power that they're going to try to get on their side of the house, like who are these individuals? Usually white, usually conservative, usually moderates, usually the individuals who, if you advocate walking and going, and we hate the po-po, want to kill him dead on the streets for show, and all the lyrics by Damn are going to laugh at your face and then knock you on the side. We tell you in their best case scenario, they get a world in which blacks are in the streets advocating for the end of society and advocating for death to society, and they themselves get shot. This is probably bad for the worst off of society. Insofar, they lose around immediately on that side of the house. So, like, that was in Jay's speech on his answers to why now radicalism is bad.
I find it as white flinch. It was the second point of the ordeal.
Whites will flinch. That is like the phrase "whites would flinch" and all the implications were right underneath it.
Just look for violent backlash specifically.
Okay.
I said there's a shot.
Yeah. Okay. Fuck. Where am I?
Thank you so much. Yeah, sorry, buddy.
Okay. But nextly, the MO stuff about how there's no understanding of what Malcolm X did. So like, if the only thing we know about ourselves or about the individual in question is that in fact the individual had some prescribed notions, and we gave you in the model that the only thing you know further and the only thing James Baldwin and Malcolm X epistemically know about themselves is teleologically some mean value of all the time they lived in, i.e. you don't get the last part of James Baldwin, you don't get when James Baldwin was old, you don't get when Malcolm X changes his flip-flop in situation. We know we gave them an advocacy, and the advocacy was to defend all the nationalism that Malcolm X prescribed. That was all in the PMC overview. Like, these were for new responses that were out in the MO.
I just think the articulation that like we're not talking about James Baldwin having the knowledge of the 90s.
Okay,
and the ideology of the 90s is kind of...
I feel like saying in the MO that Malcolm X died therefore and was highly stigmatized, I'm giving responses to some certainty about the advocacy that they are stuck with because of all the MO new responses.
Take it under consideration.
But thirdly, this is just infinitely regressive. Like, Malcolm X was highly studied within an academy. James Baldwin was highly studied within the academy. You're not in the academy. You're a 19-year-old. Why the fuck do you care about this? The very fact in the PM warrants I give you at the bottom of the PMC about the fact that you don't know literary devices. You don't know all those teaching tools. You don't know how to create good literature beside the stale stuff you do right now, all forwards the fact that James Baldwin is essential for creating better understandings of your own music. That is to say, you are a poet. The the only thing you care about is your poetry. The only thing you do right now is go to college to college, ensuring that the individuals in question can better understand your music. Why the fuck would we not get a literary figure to do that? But thirdly, they conceded to Warren that like it's just you can read all their stuff on YouTube, so they have to defend a world in which a structurally nationalist person, you can get all their speeches. They didn't give you a warrant for how Malcolm X actually teaches you anything new or has the tools to teach you, so this is entirely non-unique. But let's say, like, we've sufficiently washed all the round. We still win. Firstly, you don't believe any of these things. We told you in the PMC. Secondly, you are an emotional person who had similar epistemic trauma insofar as you advocated for loving individuals who were not actually, ambiguous individuals and were likely stigmatized in your youth because of it. And secondly, because you were an emotional black person. Thirdly, we told you there's a massive gap for this emotional complexity insofar as blacks literally cannot access this in the status quo. But finally, on the prag, because they have almost no answers to that, except for saying, you don't actually care about pragmatic outcomes. Why do you care about pragmatic outcomes? Firstly, intersectionality is probably good. Their response is, you're stealing the face of whites. If you can simultaneously get your, all your ideas and steal the ideas of women, and you simultaneously can't be a black nationalist on our side of the house, this seems like a contradiction. Weigh it down, you get the middle, which is that you're a more intersectional person and are not actually dehumanizing the people in question. Why? Because James Baldwin at least is comparatively more likely to not say the F word on their side of the house, where all of rap literally says it in the status quo. He's more likely to actually care about women, where all of rap in the status quo that they are bound to is not able to actually do any of these things. Why is this important? International markets. We told you, if we only get Europe, we win on our side of the house because you're better able to create music, you're better able to get a record deal. Thirdly, we told you, Jay-Z is going to be the one who's actually signing people. You already have an established base that answers their warrant about how it's a total crapshoot whether or not you get an album. Because you already have established base, one, because you're creating new and innovative content, even if their best case scenario, you don't buy anything, you're just following James Baldwin word for word, you're still going to be winning on our side of the house, because the final warrant that they didn't answer is that if you do not get a record album, you cannot access pragmatic outcomes, because you will always be striving to make music 20 to 30 years down the line. That is when you innovate. That is when you become Jay-Z when he's 55, creating all the fresh content that's even more radical and access to all the social capital that solves all the impacts that they go for. We are incredibly proud to propose.
I thank both sides for a truly excellent debate and request that everyone please leave so we can move forward on the call.
It's great.